I would like to start with a question, and we try to hand it over to the audience as soon as possible. Then, Joshua, the act of killing, now you brought, I think, Look of Silence. So it's basically the same big monumental event, and you made two films. How do you relate one and the other?
Well, I see the two films as a pair, as a diptych, if you like, a kind of single work whose whole is, I hope, greater than the sum of the parts. I always knew, in fact, that I would make these two films. The origin of the whole project, if you like, the scene that inspired both films is in this film. And it's the scene where the two men take me down to the river, taking turns playing victim and perpetrator. That was the first time I'd ever brought two perpetrators who didn't know each other, who'd been in different death squads. They were from neighboring villages together, to see if they would speak with each other in the same boastful way that they spoke to me. And when I heard that they did and realized they were essentially reading from a shared script, that the boasting is systemic, I had this awful feeling that I'd wandered into a place like Germany 40 years after the Holocaust, only to find the Nazis still in power. I thought this is how perpetrators might speak if they had never been removed from power and forced to acknowledge what they did was wrong and were able to cling to the lie that it was heroic. And seeing that, I knew I would spend as many years of my life as it would take to address. I knew I would make two films, one about what happens when perpetrators win and are free to write a victor's history, celebrating their actions. How do we human beings use storytelling and to escape from guilt? Essentially a film about escapism and fantasy and guilt, and that, of course, is the act of killing. But I also knew there should be another equally urgent, equally contemporary film, also about the present and not 1965, about what happens, what does it do to human beings and to a whole society to have to live with unresolved trauma, in fear, in silence for half a century, and that's the movie you've just seen.
I would like to make one remark, because I have the feeling that there's not just a diptych, there's a triptych, because you have a huge amount of footage, and this footage, I do believe, will form part of an archive accessible for the public. Like, for example, there's a huge amount of filmed footage by Spielberg on the Holocaust survivors, and it is accessible. So the third part of the triptych may be something like 1,000 hours that will be preserved somewhere and accessible.
Yeah, I like that way of thinking about it, actually, because, of course, a triptych is more common than a diptych, but a diptych is somehow more open, in that I feel like the third part belongs now to the people of Indonesia. The act of killing opened this space and helped catalyze a transformation in how Indonesia talks about its past, how the media and the public talk about their past and the present, the continued power of the thugs and the killers and the impunity for the military. Then comes the Look of Silence into that space, showing how urgently truth and reconciliation is needed, how torn the society is, and a kind of a beautiful example through Adi, and I think a little bit through the daughter of the perpetrator, who has the dignity and humanity to apologize on her father's behalf. It shows that truth, reconciliation, healing, and some form of justice is possible and needn't be so threatening. And in that sense, I like the idea that the third part of this is this archive of, it's the world's biggest archive pertaining to the genocide in Indonesia. We're working to figure out ways of making it accessible. Human rights activists and historians and scholars are already using the archive for their work. And at the same time, I see that what really needs to happen now is a struggle in Indonesia.
One practical question, and we should give it to the audience, and Adi's safety. How safe is he? I mean, you are not completely safe. You couldn't return easily to Indonesia, but maybe briefly about you. But Adi, of course, is a person who carries a danger around.
Yeah, I cannot safely return to Indonesia, and you saw at the end of the film my whole crew, some 60 filmmakers, university professors, human rights activists, human rights and environmental lawyers, heads of NGOs, changed their careers to work with me, some of them for a decade, risking their safety to make this film, these two films, because they felt it was so important, knowing they couldn't take credit for their work until there's real political change in Indonesia. I cannot safely return to Indonesia. And we shot this film after The Act of Killing was finished, but before it was released. And because once The Act of Killing's released, we knew I could no longer safely return. Adi proposed to me when we were I'd been working with Adi and first started working with him in 2003 at the beginning of my journey in Indonesia. His family was the family of survivors with whom I was closest. And when we returned to make this film, Adi said, I need to meet the perpetrators. He'd spent 8 years watching everything I had time to show him that I filmed in the years leading up to The Act of Killing, and then from the 1,000 hours of the act that went into The Act of Killing. He watched as much as he had time to see, and he was transformed by this, and then felt he needed to meet the perpetrators, hoping that they would, in meeting him, acknowledge what they did was wrong, and he would be able to forgive them, and then they would start to be able to live together as human beings instead of as victim and killer divided by fear and mutual suspicion. Anyways, I immediately said, no, it's too dangerous. But when Adi explained really why he wanted to do this, and I realized that if we could succeed in doing it, we would be doing something unprecedented, I think, in the history of nonfiction film. I don't think there's ever been a nonfiction film where survivors confront perpetrators while the perpetrators still hold a monopoly on power, when they have not been removed from power, for the simple reason that it's too dangerous. I knew it would be unprecedented in film, but more importantly, it would be unprecedented in Indonesia and a fundamental breaking of the silence. So I considered that because The Act of Killing had been made but hadn't come out yet, I was famous across the region for being close to the commanders of the men who killed Adi's brother. And so these men who Adi would want to meet, the men who killed his brother, would have to think 2 or 3 times before physically attacking us. So I saw an opportunity, because of this extremely unusual situation we were in, to do something truly unprecedented in Indonesia safely. But I also knew that if we did this, Adi's family would very likely have to relocate. And we spoke about that from the very beginning. After shooting one confrontation with Inong, the man with wearing the red glasses, with whom we knew was fairly safe because he's low down the chain of command. Before we filmed the more powerful ones, Adi tells his wife, his mother, and then his wife what he's doing, and then they saw the footage and decided to continue. In the end, they felt it was important enough what was coming from that first scene that Adi should continue, and we agreed we would discuss how to secure the family's safety before we made any decision to release the film. Well, when we had a rough cut, about 9 months ago, we spent 2 weeks together planning for the safety of the family, discussing whether we should release the film or whether it should wait until there's real political change. In the end, we've spent months putting in place a plan where the family relocated from North Sumatra, thousands of kilometers from their home, out from under the shadow of the men who did this to their family, out to some extent from the fear, trying to make the most of this terrible situation. We've worked to put the kids in much better schools, and Adi and his family in a much more supportive environment of filmmakers, critical journalists, progressive politicians and human rights activists who support Adi's tremendous courage. And of course, there's a plan B and constant communication for Adi and the family to evacuate should they need to. But at the moment, we feel there's a lot of work for Adi feels there's a lot of work for him to do in Indonesia. When the film had its Indonesian premiere on November 10th, it was unlike The Act of Killing, which began its life in secret. The Look of Silence premiere was hosted by 2 government bodies, the National Human Rights Commission and the Jakarta Arts Council, in Indonesia's largest theater. 2,000 people came, which was about twice the capacity of the theater, so they put on 2 screenings, and Adi came to both screenings unannounced to answer audiences' questions, and received a 10 or 15-minute standing ovation from an audience that was moved by his tremendous courage. And since then, Adi has been involved with releasing the film in Indonesia.
There are 2 microphones out there. I do not know, do you have one, or can you? Please go ahead. The gentleman here who had this. Yes. There's a microphone behind you. We cannot hear you otherwise. Okay.
Thank you very much for this film. Thank you very much for Act of Killing. And so I have a courage to ask 2 questions, one ethic and one aesthetic. So you have worked with such material of mass killings many years. So now, with this experience, what do you think? What made or making people do such things like they did in Indonesia? And second question, I was lucky to see your early film, one of your early films, and it seems to me that you changed your manner as a director a lot. What was the reason? It seemed to me that maybe you removed to Europe, but okay. If you agree, how do you change as a director with these last projects? And a reason of cruelty. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll take that in reverse order. I as a filmmaker, in fact, Werner was asked, without being given a chance to introduce my first film, without being given a chance to see my first film, was asked to introduce it some 15 years ago. And it was a short film, a student film. Perhaps that's what you saw. That was the first time we met. But the Act of Killing and The Look of Silence took a very long time to make. I started working with the survivors on a film that in theme and in meaning would be very similar maybe to what you've seen in The Look of Silence. We never could have had these confrontations between Adi and the perpetrators at that time before having made the Act of Killing for the reasons I just explained. But then the army threatened the survivors not to and Ramli's family in particular, Adi's family, not to participate in the film. They then asked me to film the perpetrators to see if I could find out what had happened. I agreed to try, very afraid actually. Found to my horror that all the perpetrators were instantly boastful, would tell the worst details of the killings in front of their wives and their children and grandchildren, as you've seen in the film. Showed this material back to those survivors who wanted to see it, and then together we went to show it to the human rights community in Indonesia. Everybody said, don't stop, you're onto something so important, because anyone who sees this will be forced to acknowledge, finally, that there's something terribly wrong still here today. And I undertook then a 10-year project about impunity, about what happens when killers win, about when there's no, what the nature of the effects of human evil, what are the legacies of it on perpetrators, on a whole society, on survivors, and what makes it possible, understanding that you can't understand how human beings commit evil if you don't actually, and you certainly can't understand how they live with it, and the effects of the ways they live with it affect the society in which they live. The boasting, for example, the closing down of any discussion, the fear. You can't do that unless you talk to the people who know killing, which are the people who do it. So that led to a very long journey, and I became the filmmaker that I am, although I appreciate you've seen my old work. I became the filmmaker I am through these 2 films. And so it wasn't a decision, it was a journey that changed me and made me the filmmaker I am. Very briefly, what I do think I have some insight into how, what maybe leads human beings to commit atrocities. There's all sorts of despair, hopeless despair, sort of ecstatic despair into which perpetrators throw themselves. I think that invariably, though, there's an exorbitant selfishness that is required to kill. And there is also there's also the need to the need to lie to yourself. I think, to put it briefly, I think the capacity for human evil depends on our ability to lie to ourselves. I think I'll leave it at that.
But of course it is something collective in this case. You cannot compare it to, let's say, somebody who commits murder and then tries to hide away or so.
Absolutely.
This is a phenomenon of a great amount of the community. So that's a mysterious side.
Well, again, yeah, and again and again, human communities do terrible things, and newcomers into them, whether it's the atrocities in the Belgian Congo, whether it's the Holocaust, every genocide that's occurred, people are inducted into it, and they follow the norms of behavior into which they come. And I don't think it's into which they encounter. I don't think it's because they're psychopaths. Primo Levi said there are perhaps some monsters or psychopaths out there, and I'm not quoting him exactly, but they're too few to worry about. The real concern is, I think, the systems, the systemic behavior, the norms of behavior that we follow blindly. Hannah Arendt said of Eichmann, and I think it's maybe the best encapsulation of, I think, the psychology of Eichmann. She said he's guilty of nothing but an acute shallowness. And I think that's true of somehow of every perpetrator that I've met. It requires an acute shallowness.
Yeah. There is a microphone here. Yes, please.
I have two brief questions. Did you watch any of the archives or broadcasts of the South African Truth and Reconciliation process during the making or before the making of the film? And do you think that we as human beings will ever be able to transcend structure or systems?
I think that I would say two things. I didn't watch the archive, really, of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission because I understood that what Adi is doing is fundamentally different because it's taking place in the absence of any process or legal process. I did see one clip, though, once, not in preparation for this film, where a son is finding out some awful thing, how a killer, I think, murdered his brother, his older brother. And he gets so angry, and it's part of an official meeting set up by the state, that he picks up an ashtray, if I recall, and hits the perpetrator over the head, and the man's taken to hospital. And it's, of course, only in the framework of this change of regime, post-1994, that the victim is able to even begin to safely take out his anger in that way. Here, one thing I did know making this film is that only a very uniquely empathic and gentle and curious man, such as Adi, would want to do this and could do this safely in a place like Indonesia now. And the other question was
whether we collectively...
yeah, I remember. Whether we can overcome the collective. I think that the distinction between the collective and the individual is a false one. It's not even worth mentioning somehow. Maybe I mentioned it in my previous answer and I therefore will sound like a hypocrite, but I think I as a human being don't know how to feed myself without a society that delivers food to grocery stores, wouldn't know how to clothe myself. I think Werner would know, but I wouldn't. And maybe you could help me out if we're ever in this situation. I wouldn't know. I feel like the distinction, we are fundamentally like ants and wasps. We are collective. And we are also, unlike ants and wasps, individual, and those two things are inseparable. The language through which we know ourselves, the stories and fantasies through which we imagine ourselves, and this was very much the subject of The Act of Killing, are inherited, are second-hand, third-rate, half-remembered, but collective. So I think the hope there, if you've seen The Act of Killing and you take its fundamental lesson or fundamental starting point as well, that every act of evil in our history has been committed by human beings like us. If you take that and the idea that we are fundamentally collective, the hope is that we can, as human beings, if we are mindful of it, build better collective structures. And we've succeeded in some places better than others, but even where we've done the best at it, we always depend on the suffering of others, so far in our history, on the terrible suffering of others elsewhere.
Okay, thank you for this film, Joshua, because act of killing was a kind of nightmare for me, and the look of silence came to me very good. I mean, it's kind of therapy, it's kind of goodness, and we really wanted to listen to the voice of Adi and the people like Adi, and to see humanity. I mean, means to me that there must be hope. There will be hope for Indonesia, I guess. My question is, what about the profession of Adi and the glasses and the looking and seeing? It's a kind of metaphorical way to tell the story of Indonesia, the story of the victims, and the kind of ways of seeing, like John Berger said. I want to hear your opinion about it.
Well, first I want to thank you for that personal experience of the two films, because for me the act of killing was a kind of nightmare too to make. People often ask me, were you afraid making it? I think they're talking about physical fear. I was not usually physically afraid, I was emotionally terrified. And this film, actually we were physically afraid because of the threats and so forth. We had all sorts of, we had like backup cars, backup vehicles, getaway vehicles, so we could escape without being followed, and all sorts of safety precautions we took during the shoot. But it was also for me emotionally healing to make this film. It was to end my journey in Indonesia with this family that I love so much and with whom I began the journey was healing for me. Adi is indeed an optometrist, and midway through the making of The Act of Killing, I found out that he was sufficiently affected by watching all of this footage we had shot, and that he would watch it with the same intent, curiosity, pain that you see in the look of silence. He was watching all this footage and really drinking it in. He couldn't see enough of it. And then I understood it was affecting him so much that when he was doing his work, and anyone over 60, he would ask what they remember of 1965, as you see early in the film, and he would get different answers. Sometimes he'd meet perpetrators, sometimes survivors, sometimes people would get angry at him. People would be reluctant to talk, sometimes people would open up. And when I learned that, I understood this is a powerful metaphor. Here's a man who is trying to help people see for a profession, and he's going to encounter people who are willfully blind. I think, though, as a nonfiction filmmaker, you kind of, maybe you do this through the pre-production and writing and pre-production of a fiction film, till you really grow your metaphors. It's like tending them in a garden. So at some point when we were shooting the scene with, I knew what each of the perpetrators would say to Adi about what they had done, because I'd filmed them years before. And I knew, therefore, Inong would talk about these awful things. He had some of the worst stories. About the brother who climbs the tree and gives the call to prayer. And I anticipated that him with these red frames on his eyes would be this powerful metaphor. I think I've told you one layer of its meaning, but I tend to agree with something you say. I think it's beyond that. I think it's a metaphor in a way for something also that it's a metaphor for something that I don't know, too. And so I understood this will be a powerful metaphor, and I started shooting those confrontations in that way. We would often, when it was safe, we would shoot with 2 cameras, though not always. Half of those meetings are with 2 cameras, half with 1. That was one which was with 2 cameras because it was relatively safe. And I instructed one of the cameras to be in a close-up the whole time, frontal on his face, so that this sort of tableau of a man, that it wouldn't be an image of a man in a conversation, it would be a kind of tableau of a man describing details from Dante's Inferno, framed by these cheap plastic but also scarlet lenses.
I would like to enlarge the question of the young lady, because you were speaking about the voice of Adi, but there's something else. There's the silence of Adi. There's a silence, and Joshua films in it. Let's speak a little bit about filmmaking. I'm a colleague, and I'm stunned how you're, for example, when he talks to his uncle, and then there's silence, and the camera pans from silence as if there was an answer. There's silence, and it pans back. It's uncut, as if you were covering a dialogue. You are covering silence the same way you are covering a dialogue. And of course, then there are these mysterious moments, tableau or strange images somewhere in a landscape or the river, or incredible things like these little jumping beans. It's completely and utterly mysterious. And they do not need to be explained. There's silence from this, but there's something, some life in there. And you see, the discourse is always foremost and first has to be about the political side. Since I'm a filmmaker, I see the great art and the great understanding of cinema that's in Joshua. It's not, you see, you could have made easily some sort of a journalist's film, and documentaries have to divorce themselves from journalism, and what you are doing is filmmaking. It's truly filmmaking, and you are staging and you are covering silences. You are covering very mysterious things and how you put it together. So there's much more than just a political statement, and it's much more than just the silent the voice of Adi, and that's why the title is. And I'm glad that I'm a filmmaker and I can point these things out. For me, it's a great film always keeps a mystery. Only the shallow films you can explain somehow, and there are things in it that stun me and take my breath away, and I have no explanation, and it should stay like this. The jumping beans, I don't know what it is, and it should stay as it is.
Well, I very much understood that this film, that this film would be a film about memory, and I understood that this film would be a kind of backwards-looking film, in the sense that so many films that deal with atrocity have a kind of hope. Where you have someone, whether it's a campaign or a hero, or that leaves you with the message, that the sense that something is fighting the good fight. And while we have Adi, who's doing something good in the film, within the film itself, he fails. He never gets the apology that he wants. And we see only, although we see glimmers of hope in him and in the daughter, we see a society that's torn apart 50 years later. Yeah. And I knew that, and I felt that I wanted a film that looks back and stands in silence somehow, in memoriam for the dead who cannot be wakened, and for the lives that are broken and can never be restored. I knew to do that I would have to focus on silence itself, that I would have to create a kind of poem to silence. And that means in the confrontations, I'm filming much more the reactions than I am the lines, because it's there that you see.
Yes, and also one of the real outstanding figures is the father who is somehow separated from his memories. He does have memories, and he sings a song, a love song from his youth, and he believes he's 16. And he gets lost at the end. I mean, it's very, very intense what you are doing there. And it's for me, the greatest metaphor about memory and how we are lost in memories and how memories are changing and how we are changing. So there's a very, very deep parallel second other film there that's for the audience. And a great film always has a separate, a different story that only occurs inside of an audience. And that's something very hard to create and to understand as a filmmaker. And here you have something where the audience can rush ahead or look back and have a different timing, an inner different story, and you bring it in through, for example, the character of the father. So it's very real understanding of storytelling, because it's not the story alone that is occurring here on the screen. There's a separate story that occurs in the audience.
It's also, I think that's also about giving space away from words. It's something that actually I learn in your work. I learned from your work very much. There's a lot of space, and Adi is someone who, that's true even, I think, in The Act of Killing. If you've only seen the shorter theatrical cut, I urge you to see the longer uncut version of the film, which is, I think, on iTunes and DVD here in Germany.
You have to see the longer version, because normally directors' cuts are boring and they're way too long, and superficial material is in there. In his case, it's the only case that I know where the director's cut it's longer, but it doesn't matter. It's deeper. It adds depth. So if you really want to see The Act of Killing, you have to go for the DVD or...
In Germany, it's the version on DVD and on iTunes.
Yes.
It's the same.
That's the only real legitimate version.
Thank you. In both films, I'm focusing as much as I can on silences, people responding to words, people who don't believe the words that they're saying, people who are devastated by something they've seen or heard or remembered, but not putting words to that feeling. And in the case of this parallel film that Werner was talking about here, in The Look of Silence, there's these shots of Adi watching. Adi actually, as a protagonist, has very few words. And that, I hope, gives you this space to make each of you your own Adi, in a sense, to build your own relationship to Adi, and therefore to all the old footage that Adi's watching, and to Adi's father. And that, of course, I hope makes the film much more personal, because it's not because it's intimate with the family, which it is, but because it's yours. Each and every one of you has a different Adi, a different family, a different atrocity, a different legacy of genocide, and a different Look of Silence.
The microphone is over there, please.
Thank you very much for that brilliant movie, and thank you very much for The Act of Killing. What has happened since you published The Act of Killing in Indonesia? Has actually anyone watched it? And my second question is, obviously, not only the people in Indonesia need to deal with what happened in 1965, but also the West. And I think that was a brilliant scene that NBC news episode in The Look of Silence, which was truly, truly horrible. And so there is a responsibility of the West or of America, and we as kind of like the children and grandchildren of McCarthy have a responsibility. So what are we supposed to make out of that? And is you doing that movie from the outside, is that our response as also the ones responsible from the West to what we have done in 1965? Is that our responsibility, or is that actually another form of neocolonialism in the sense of we are getting involved again?
Well, there was a lot there. As an American and a German American in Berlin, I think really that scene is really important to me, the one where we see the Goodyear plantation. Because on that Goodyear plantation, we see a company that's using, a multinational company, one of the biggest in the world, using slave labor, who every night are being sent back to their concentration camp, and then dispatched out, when they're finished being useful to the company, to death squads to be killed, a mere 20 years after Auschwitz. Birkenau, where the same thing was happening.
But the voice of the commentary is so frightening. And the way it's explained, it's just as if you had scripted it.
Absolutely.
And it's so real that it doesn't appear to be real anymore. It's so frightening.
I think that the fact that I think that's right. That's a good point. But the point I was going to make was that a mere 20 years after the Holocaust, American corporations were doing the same thing that German corporations had been doing around Auschwitz. And this is a pretty enormous stain on the United States' record, my country's record, to be a force for freedom and democracy in the post-war world. And all the more so that the way that is narrated to our country, first of all, it's not hidden, as you saw, nor is it criticized. It's taken as acceptable, perhaps because the people, as you raised in your question, are not white. They're somehow disposable. And they can say without any irony that Bali is more beautiful now without the communists, as though we just accept that every tropical paradise we visit is in fact also a mass grave. And I think the question about our responsibility, first of all, when I said in 2003 I was working with survivors, it's because I first went in 2001 to that plantation where Romley's body is buried, where Romley's grave is, and that you saw in the film, to help the plantation workers there make their own film about their struggle to organize a union in the aftermath of the military dictatorship in Indonesia. And the women workers were made by a Belgian corporation to spray a weed killer with no protective clothing, no masks, no gloves, and the mist would go into their lungs and then livers, and kill them in their 40s. They were dying, the women with whom I was living to make this film. In fact, one of my closest friends from that village died the day of the world premiere of The Act of Killing 2 years ago. And I had this so when I had this realization that it was as though I mentioned earlier, it's as though I wandered into Germany 40 years after the Holocaust only to find the Nazis still in power. It was with the awareness that this is not some surreal science fiction scenario, what if the Nazis had won? This is not the exception to the rule. This is the rule. Because if in Indonesia there was this atrocity that I'd never heard of, which has this terrifying legacy, and the fear is why our vegetable oil is so cheap, then what about all the atrocities across the global south that I have heard of, where everything else we buy comes from? So here I am wearing a jacket from actually Indonesia, trousers from maybe Bangladesh, and all of it is haunted by the suffering of the people who make it. And so I think we have a great and ongoing responsibility, and we deal with this in different ways. I don't think personal lifestyle choices will be the answer. We need bigger collective solutions. I also think that making this film never felt like I was an American exposing these atrocities for an international audience. I always, from the very beginning, was entrusted by the human rights community and the survivors and my anonymous Indonesian collaborators to do something that they couldn't safely do themselves. So I always felt like their agent, if you like. And the intention, yes, it was hoped that the film would reach an international audience, but above all, the hope was that The Act of Killing and then The Look of Silence would be a mirror held up to Indonesia so that Indonesians finally would be able to talk about their most painful problems. And that's how the film, to answer your first question, has come to Indonesia. It's come like the child in the Act of Killing came like the child in the emperor's new clothes, pointing out these awful things that everybody was too afraid to talk about and forcing them into the open. The film's been screened thousands of times across the country, downloaded millions of times, and led the media in Indonesia to talk about the genocide as a genocide. As I said, it started its life in secret, only through secret screenings. The support of the media allowed that to change, and the Look of Silence started its life publicly, sponsored by the National Human Rights Commission and the Jakarta Arts Council, two government bodies, and 53,000 people, well, more, of the minority of screenings which told us how many people came to their screenings. 53,000 people saw the film in screenings like this in the first couple weeks, and we can assume that it was many, many more because most screening organizers didn't tell us.
Ladies and gentlemen, I get urgent signals that we have to clear the place. Thank you very much. Joshua. And ladies and gentlemen, you have one duty now. Please tell your friends about the two films.
Thank you.